Martha Calloway threw open her door with her dead husband's rifle shaking in her hands and froze. The monster the whole town swore would kill her stood 3 feet away, ribs showing eyes wet with something that wasn't rage. He lowered his great gray head and set a single white stone at her bare feet. Then he was gone. For 7 mornings he came. And on the 7th, she understood and her knees gave out. Subscribe and stay with me to the very end, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The rifle was heavier than she remembered. Martha Calloway stood in her doorway, with the stock pressed wrong against her shoulder, the barrel wandering because her arms wouldn't hold steady, and she stared at the thing in her yard that the whole of Mercy Hollow had told her would one day be the death of somebody. "Don't you move," she said. Her voice came out thin. "Don't you take 1 step toward this house." The horse did not move. That was the first thing wrong with him. A wild animal that size, half-starved by the look of those ribs, ought to have spooked at the sight of her at the metal in her hands at her shouting. Instead, the great gray draft horse stood with his enormous head hung low, and he looked at her the way a man looks at the floor when he has come to beg and is ashamed of it. Then he lowered that head another inch, and she heard a small, dull sound on the boards of her porch. Thud. He had set something down. He had carried it in his mouth and set it down gentle as you please, and now he turned slow, his hooves heavy in the dust, and he walked off without ever once looking back. Martha kept the rifle up until he was small in the distance. Then she lowered it, and her arms began to shake in earnest, and she had to lean against the doorframe to keep her feet. There was a stone on her porch, a smooth white stone the size of a man's fist. Mama. Caleb was behind her in his nightshirt, 16 years old and already taller than she was. His hair stuck up on one side from sleep. He had her late husband's eyes. He had that same way of going still and quiet when he was frightened the way Thomas used to. "Get back inside," Martha said. "Was that—" Caleb came to the door anyway and looked out and saw the horse far off, a gray shape swallowed by the heat already rising off the flat. His breath caught. "That's the Harlan horse. That's the killer. Mama, that's the one that put Del Sutton in his bed for a month. I know what it is. What's it doing here?" Martha looked down at the stone. She did not have an answer for him, and not having an answer for her son was a particular kind of misery she had carried since the day they buried his father, so she gave him the only thing she had, which was an order. "Go put the coffee on," she said, "and get dressed. You've got the pike fences to mend before the sun gets up over the ridge." He went because he was a good boy, and because he could hear in her voice that the conversation was finished. Martha stood another long moment. Then she bent and picked up the stone. It was warm. That was the strange thing. The morning was already warm. Summer in the Arizona Territory came down hard and early, but the stone was warmer than the air, like it had been held a long while. She turned it over in her hand. There was nothing remarkable about it. A river stone, smooth white, the kind a child might pocket. She set it on the rail and went inside and did not think about it again until noon, when the whole town had already decided what it meant. She walked into Mercy Hollow a little after midday with 3 finished shirts wrapped in paper, because finished shirts were 30 cents apiece, and 30 cents apiece was the difference between a son who ate and a son who didn't, and she had not gone 4 steps past the livery before she understood that they knew. She could always tell when they knew something. The town had a way of going quiet around her, a held-breath quiet, and then the whispering would start up again behind her back like water finding a crack. "Mrs. Calloway." Ruth Harlan came out of the stable wiping her hands on a rag, and Ruth was the only one of them who would say her name to her face, so Martha stopped. Ruth Harlan was 55 and built like a fence post and had buried 2 husbands and run that livery alone through both, and she did not waste words. "Mrs. Harlan, that animal come to your place this morning?" It was not a question. Martha shifted the package of shirts in her arms. "He did. How'd he get loose?" Ruth said more to herself than to Martha and shook her head. "I had that paddock chained. I chained it myself." She looked at Martha hard. "He hurt you?" "No." "He hurt the boy?" "No, Mrs. Harlan. He didn't hurt anybody. He set a stone on my porch, and he left." Ruth Harlan stared at her. Around them, Martha could feel the others gathering at the edges, 2 women outside the dry goods, a man by the water trough ears, all turned the same direction. "A stone," Ruth repeated. "A stone. Mrs. Calloway." Ruth lowered her voice, and there was something in it that Martha had not heard from her before, something close to gentleness, which from Ruth Harlan was nearly alarming. "That horse near killed Del Sutton in the spring, crushed 2 of his ribs against the rail, and would have done worse if 3 men hadn't dragged him off. I have kept that animal because I am too stubborn and too poor to put a bullet in $1,800 of horseflesh, but make no mistake about what he is. He is not right in the head, and a thing that is not right in the head does not pick a house out of kindness." "Then what does it do it out of?" Martha said. Ruth had no answer for that, so she did what people did when they had no answer. She made it Martha's fault. "You ought to keep that boy of yours close," Ruth said, and turned back toward the dark of the stable. "And you ought to think on what kind of woman draws a thing like that to her door." The whispering rose up behind Martha all the way down the street. She had heard it before. She had heard it the first winter after Thomas died, when she could not pay the burying, and Jeremiah Pike had paid it for her, and the town had decided that meant something it did not mean. She had heard it every time she walked in alone, a widow, a woman who took in mending, and lived a half-mile out past the decent edge of town in a house with a sinking porch. She had grown a skin against it the way you grow a callus by being rubbed raw in the same place over and over until it stops bleeding. But this was a new word in an old mouth, and the new word was cursed, and it followed her into the dry goods store where she laid her 3 shirts on the counter for Mr. Avery to inspect. 30 cents, she said. "Same as last week." Mr. Avery looked at the shirts and did not pick them up. "Heard you had a visitor." "I'll take it in store credit if the coin's short. Folks are saying," Mr. Avery said, "that the Harlan horse went straight to your place. Past every other house. Straight to yours." "Folks say a great deal, Mr. Avery. The shirts are 30 cents. He paid her, but he paid her slow, and he counted the coins into her hand without letting his fingers touch hers, and Martha understood that something had shifted under her feet that morning. Some ground she had thought was solid, and that the town had been waiting a long time for a reason, and the horse had finally given them one. She did not break. She had not broken in 3 years, and she was not going to break over coin counted slow. She put the money in the pocket she had sewn into her skirt, and she walked the half-mile home with her chin level, and she did not let herself run even when she wanted to, even when the heat pressed down and the whispering still rang in her ears. It was only when she got to her own porch and saw Caleb sitting on the step with his head in his hands that something in her chest pulled tight. "What is it?" she said. "What happened?" He looked up. His face was red and not from the heat. "They were laughing at me," he said. "At the Pike place, the Pike boys and 2 others. They said," he stopped. "They said you bewitched the horse. They said that's why Pa died, that you're—" "Don't." Martha set the store credit down and crossed to him and took his face in both her hands the way she had when he was small, and the way he was nearly too big to allow anymore. "You listen to me, Caleb Calloway. Look at me. There is nothing wrong with your mother. There is nothing in this world that I have done that you need to carry. Do you hear me?" "Then why is it coming here?" he whispered. And that was the question. Wasn't it? That was the whole of it, 16 years old, and already learning that the world will hand you shame you did not earn and call it yours. "I don't know," Martha said. It cost her to say it. "But I am going to find out, and until I do, you are going to hold your head up because we have done nothing. Nothing. You understand me." He nodded. He didn't believe her. She could see he didn't. But he nodded, and that was something, and she held him a moment longer than he wanted, and then she sent him to wash for supper. That night she sat up long after Caleb had gone to sleep, the white stone in her hand, turning it over and over by the light of the lamp she could barely afford to burn. She thought about Ruth Harlan's voice. A thing that is not right in the head does not pick a house out of kindness, but it had not felt like a thing that was not right in the head. That was what she could not say to Ruth what she could barely say to herself. When that horse had stood in her yard with his head down, she had not felt hunted. She had felt, and she was ashamed of the thought, even as she had it, she had felt recognized. The way you feel when somebody who has been suffering a long time finally looks at somebody else who has been suffering a long time, and a thing passes between them without a word, and it is not comfort exactly, but it is the absence of being alone. She put the stone on the windowsill and blew out the lamp. He came again the next morning. This time she did not bring the rifle. She did not know why. She heard the thud on the porch boards just before dawn, the same heavy sound, and she got up in her nightdress and went to the door and opened it, and there he was, the great gray monster of Mercy Hollow, and at her feet lay a second white stone. "You again?" she said softly. The horse's ears came forward at her voice, just slightly. And his eyes, she made herself look at his eyes, this time really look. His eyes were not the eyes of a killer. They were wide and dark and ringed white, with a fear so old and so deep that she recognized it because she had seen it in her own glass in the bad months after Thomas. That look of a creature that has learned the world is a thing that happens to you and cannot be stopped. "What is it?" she whispered. "What do you want from me?" He took a step back, then another, and then, like before, he turned and walked away into the gray of the early morning, and she stood holding the doorframe and watched until he was gone. 2 stones now. She set the second beside the first on the windowsill. He came the 3rd morning and the 4th. By the 4th morning the town had stopped pretending to whisper. "It's an omen," she heard a woman say outright, not even bothering to lower her voice when Martha came in for thread. 4 mornings. My grandmother knew a woman in Missouri that animals followed like that, and they found her 3 children drowned in the—" "That's enough, Edna," said another voice, and Martha turned surprised to find a man she did not know stepping out of the shadow of the porch post. He was perhaps 36, lean, sun-dark, with a quietness to him that made the loud woman shut her mouth. He wore a trail rider's clothes worn through and honest, and there was a scar that ran from his left ear down under his collar, an old one, white with age. He touched the brim of his hat to Martha, a small thing, but no man in Mercy Hollow had tipped his hat to her in 3 years, and it caught her off guard so badly she nearly forgot to answer. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't believe we've met. Eli Boone. Mrs. Harlan took me on at the livery a few days back. Horsebreaker mostly. Trail work when there's trail work." He paused. "I've been watching that gray of hers." The woman Edna sniffed and gathered her skirts and went. Eli Boone watched her go, and then turned back to Martha, and there was no cruelty in his face, which was so rare in that town that Martha did not know what to do with it. "He's been coming to your place," Eli said. It was not an accusation. It was a fact laid down flat for them both to look at. "He has. Bringing things. Stones." Martha lifted her chin, waiting for the laugh. Waiting for the omen talk, waiting for it the way you wait for a slap you've already decided not to flinch from. But Eli Boone did not laugh. He frowned slow and careful, like a man reading sign on hard ground. "Stones," he repeated. "Just stones, same kind. White ones. River stones, I'd guess. Smooth." She watched him. "You don't think it's an omen?" "No, ma'am." He said it plain. "I think a horse that brings the same thing to the same place 4 mornings running is a horse that's trying to tell somebody something. I've broke 100 horses, and I never met one yet that did a thing 4 times for no reason. They ain't built for nonsense. Men are. Horses ain't." He looked at her, and something in his level gaze steadied her in a way she had not been steadied since Thomas. "A horse doesn't lie, ma'am. Men do. You remember that whatever this town tells you." Martha did not trust it. She had learned not to trust kindness from strangers because kindness from strangers usually wanted something, and she had nothing left to give. But she found herself saying before she could stop it, "He's frightened. The horse. I've looked at his eyes. He's frightened half to death of something." Eli nodded slowly. "I've seen that in him too. He don't act mean. He acts scared. There's a difference, and most folks can't tell it, but a scared horse and a mean horse are two whole different animals. Whatever's wrong with that gray?" He stopped and chose his words. Something happened to him. Something a horse don't forget. What could happen to a horse to make him carry stones to a stranger's door? "I don't know yet," Eli said, "but I aim to find out if you'll let me." The fifth stone came, the sixth. The town's mood had curdled past whispering into something with teeth. A boy threw a rock at Caleb on the road and called his mother a witch, and Caleb came home with a split lip and would not say who'd done it, and Martha sat up that whole night with her jaw set so hard it ached. Because there is a particular fury a mother feels that has no place to go, and it is the worst fury there is. "Maybe we should leave," Caleb said over breakfast, not meeting her eyes. "Go to Tucson. Start over where nobody knows us." "With what?" Martha said. "We have $11 and a mule, Caleb." "Then make it stop coming. Tell Mrs. Harlan to chain it. Shoot it if you have to." His voice cracked. "I'm sick of being the witch's son. I'm sick of it, Mama." The word shoot landed in her like a stone of its own. She thought of those dark, wide, frightened eyes. She thought of a creature that had come to her only to her 6 mornings running, picking her house out of every house in Mercy Hollow, and she could not have said why, but the thought of a bullet in him turned her stomach. "I'm not going to shoot a frightened animal," she said quietly, "to make this town comfortable." Caleb pushed back from the table. "Then you care more about that horse than you do about me." And he was gone out the door before she could answer, gone to the pike fences, and Martha sat alone with the words hanging in the air. And for the first time in 3 years, she put her face in her hands and let herself shake. She was still sitting there when the knock came. It was Jeremiah Pike, 72 years old, leaning on his stick, the only man besides Eli Boone who had ever shown her plain kindness. He had paid Thomas's burying. He had a face like cracked leather and hands ruined by 40 years in the quarry before his knees gave out, and he stood in her doorway, turning his hat in those ruined hands. "Heard about the boy's lip," he said. "Pike boys, was it? My grandsons." He shook his head, ashamed. "I'll tan them myself. That ain't how I raised their father, and it ain't how their father should have raised them." "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Pike." "No." He fixed her with one pale eye. "But I came about something else. Heard the Gray's been bringing you stones. White ones." He held out his hand. "Show me one." She didn't know why she fetched it, but she went to the windowsill, where 6 white stones now sat in a row, and she chose one, and she put it in his ruined old hand, and she watched his face change. He went still. He turned the stone over, and his thumb found the surface of it, and his breath came out of him slow. "Mr. Pike." "Where'd he get this?" Jeremiah Pike said. His voice had gone strange. "Where in God's name did that animal get this?" "What is it?" "It's just a river stone." "It ain't a river stone." Jeremiah closed his fist around it. "I worked that quarry 40 years, Mrs. Calloway. I'd know this rock blind. This here is quarry stone. White quartz vein stone. There's exactly one place in 50 miles you find it." He looked up at her, and now there was fear in his old face, real fear, the fear of a man who has just heard a door he thought was nailed shut creak open in the dark. "The old workings, up above the hollow. The shaft that collapsed and killed 3 men 20 years gone that we sealed and swore we'd never open again." The room had gone very quiet. "That's where this come from," Jeremiah said. "And that horse is carrying it down here 1 stone at a time, 6 mornings running, and laying it at the feet of the one soul in this town that'll listen." His old hand was trembling now. "Mrs. Calloway, things were buried up at that quarry that weren't just rock. There was talk 20 years back. Talk that the collapse weren't no accident. Talk we all buried right along with those men because it was easier to bury than to dig up." He swallowed. "I always told myself it was just talk. And now?" The old man looked down at the white stone in his fist, as though it had spoken to him. "Now," he said slowly, "I think something up in that hill has been waiting 20 years for somebody to come and dig." She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark and listened to her son's breathing through the thin wall, and she turned it over and over. A horse who picked her house. A horse half mad with a fear that did not look like madness when you got close. 6 white stones from a sealed shaft where 3 men died in a collapse that maybe was not a collapse. A town that wanted her to make it stop, to shoot the animal, to leave, to be quiet, to bury it the way they had buried everything else. And under it all, deeper than all of it, the thing she had felt the first morning when those dark eyes met hers, recognized. She thought she understood it now. She thought she understood it in a way that frightened her more than any omen, because she knew what it was to be the one who saw the truth, and to have a whole town tell you that you were wrong, that you were strange, that you ought to be quiet, that the easy lie was kinder than the hard truth. She knew what it was to carry a thing nobody else would carry alone for years, with no one to set it down for. That horse had been trying to set something down. 6 mornings he had carried it to her door because some animal sense in him had picked the one creature in Mercy Hollow who would not call him a monster and turn away. And she had nearly let her own son talk her into a bullet. She got up before dawn. She did not bring the rifle. She stood on her sinking porch in the gray light, and she waited, and at the first edge of sun she heard them, the heavy, slow hooves coming up the track, and then the great gray shape resolving out of the dimness ribs, showing head low that smooth white stone held careful in his mouth. He came to the bottom of her steps, and he stopped. "I know now," Martha said softly. She did not move toward him. She did not want to spook him. "I know where you've been bringing them from. I know what's up in that hill." The horse stood very still. "You've been trying to tell somebody for a long time, haven't you?" she said, and her voice broke on it, because she was not only talking to the horse, and they both knew it. "And nobody would listen. They all looked at you and saw a monster, because it was easier than seeing what you were really showing them." He lowered his head. The stone dropped to the bottom step. The 7th stone. And then the great gray draft horse took one slow step toward her, and another, and a third, until his enormous head was level with her chest, close enough that she could feel the warm push of his breath, close enough that she could see her own face reflected in that dark, frightened eye. And Martha Calloway, who had not let herself cry in front of anyone in 3 long years, felt her knees give way beneath her. She sank down onto the top step. She did not reach for him. She only let him be near. And from somewhere very deep from the place she kept the locked-away grief of a buried husband and a shamed son, and 3 years of counted coins and slow-counted change and whispers at her back, it all came loose at once. "All right," she whispered. Her hand pressed to her mouth, the tears running hot down her wrists. "All right. I hear you. God help me, I'm the only one in this whole town that does, but I hear you. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. Whatever's up in that hill." Her voice failed. She made herself say it. "Whatever's up there, we're going to go and bring it down into the light, you and me both." The horse stood over her breathing, while the sun came up white over the ridge, and the whole valley began to fill with the hard heat of another summer morning. And for a long while, neither of them moved the broken widow and the broken animal, the 2 creatures in all of Mercy Hollow, that the town had decided to look away from, sitting together on a sinking porch with 7 white stones laid out between them, and the truth of what happened 20 years ago, waiting up in the hills for someone at last brave enough to come and listen. The decision did not stay a secret long, because nothing in Mercy Hollow ever did. By the time Martha walked into town that morning to find Eli Boone, 2 women had already seen her sitting on her porch with the gray horse standing over her like a guardian, and what those 2 women saw had grown 3 new heads by the time it reached the dry goods store. She heard the shape of it before she reached the livery, talking to it now. The witch is sitting and talking to the cursed thing, like it was Christian company. She let it roll off her. There was a hardness setting into her this morning that surprised her. A hardness she had not felt since the night Thomas died, and she found she did not much care anymore what Edna Avery and her like had to say. She found Eli in the corral behind the stable, a rope coiled loose in his hand, watching the gray from across the rails. He did not look up when she came to stand beside him, but he knew she was there. "He let you near him," Eli said. "This morning, folks are saying. He set the 7th stone at my feet and walked up the steps to me." Martha put her hands on the top rail. "Mr. Boone, I need your help." "Eli. Eli." She watched the horse. He was at the far side of the corral, head up now, ears swiveling at every sound from the street, never still a creature that had not known a moment's peace in a long time. "Mr. Pike says the stones are quarry stone, from the old workings up above the hollow, the shaft that collapsed 20 years ago." Eli went still in a way she was learning to read. "The sealed one. The sealed one." She turned to face him. "I aim to go up there. I aim to find out what that animal's been trying to tell me, and I'd rather not go alone." For a long moment, Eli Boone said nothing. He coiled and uncoiled the rope in his hand. When he spoke, it was slow. "You know what they'll say about you. A widow and a hired man going up into the hills together." "They've already said worse," Martha answered. "I've stopped paying their tongues rent in my head." Something moved at the corner of Eli's mouth that was almost a smile gone before it formed. "All right," he said. "But not today. That horse won't lead us anywhere while he's wound up like a watch spring, and you and I don't know that country. A body can break a leg up in those old workings and never be found. We go careful or we don't go." He looked at her sidelong. "You bring the boy." "The boy." Martha's jaw tightened. "Caleb thinks I love the horse more than I love him. Boys say things. He said I should shoot it." Eli nodded slowly, and he did not offer her any easy comfort, which she respected him for. "He's scared, ma'am. Scared boys reach for the loudest thing in the room. Don't mean it's what's in his heart." He looked back at the gray. "You want my honest read, you bring him. A boy that age, you leave him home while his mother walks off into the hills with a hired man and a mad horse. That boy's gonna sit and stew and decide every ugly thing the town says is true. You take him with you, he sees it with his own eyes. Can't argue with what a man's seen himself." She had not thought of it that way. She turned it over and found it sound, and she felt something loosen in her chest, the simple relief of standing next to a person who thought clearly and did not flinch. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow, at first light." But it was not to be tomorrow, because that evening, everything changed. She came home to find Caleb sitting on the porch step with his back to her, and for one cold instant, her heart seized, thinking him hurt again. Then she saw what he was doing. He was holding one of the white stones, turning it over in his hands the way she had by the last gray light, his head bent over it. "Caleb," he startled, and nearly dropped it. When he looked up, his split lip had scabbed dark, and his eyes were red, and he had the look of a boy who had been arguing with himself all day and losing. "Mr. Pike came by," Caleb said. "After you left. He told me about the quarry, about the stones." He swallowed. "He told me what they used to say, about the collapse not being an accident." Martha sat down beside him on the step, slow the way you sit near a deer you don't want to spook. "And what do you think?" she asked. Caleb was quiet a long time. Out past the yard the light was failing, and somewhere a coyote started up and quit. When he finally spoke, his voice was very small, and it was the voice of the little boy he had been, not the angry young man he was becoming. "I think I said something terrible to you this morning." His mouth worked. About you caring more for the horse. I didn't mean it. I just..." His eyes filled, and he scrubbed at them furious at himself. "Everyone's been laughing at me, Mama, for weeks. And I wanted it to stop, and I didn't care how. And then Mr. Pike showed me..." He held up the stone. "He showed me it's real. There's something really up there. And you knew. You knew the whole time something was wrong when everybody else just wanted to call it a curse and look away." He looked at her, and the shame in his young face was almost more than she could bear. "You were the only one listening, and I told you to shoot it. Caleb, I want to come with you," he said fast before he could lose his nerve. "Mr. Pike said you mean to go up to the workings. I want to come. I don't want to be the boy who sat home scared while his mama did the brave thing." His voice broke clean in half. "I want to be like you." Martha put her arm around her son and pulled him into her, and he came 16, and too big and shaking, and she held him on the sinking porch in the dark and felt the last 3 years crack open and bleed and begin very slowly to close. "You already are," she whispered into his hair. "You already are, Caleb. You came around to the truth, even when the truth cost you. That's the bravest thing a person can do. Braver than I am half the time." They sat like that a while. Then Caleb sat up and wiped his face and tried to make his voice steady, and he was so much like Thomas in that moment that it stopped her breath. "When do we go?" "First light. Eli Boone's coming." Caleb nodded, and then because he was 16 and could not stay solemn for long, he said, "Folks are going to talk something fierce about you in that horsebreaker." "Let them," Martha said, and she found she meant it all the way down. The gray would not lead them at first. That was the trouble none of them had reckoned on. At first light, the 3 of them stood at the corral with Eli's 2 saddle horses ready, and a lantern, and a length of stout rope, and Jeremiah Pike's old miner's pick, and the gray draft horse paced the rails and would not so much as look toward the hills. "He won't go," Caleb said. "Maybe he's done. Maybe he brought the stones and now he's—" "He's not done," Martha said, but she was not sure. She came to the rail and spoke low. Hey now, you brought me 7 of them. You walked all that way 7 mornings. Don't you quit on me now." The horse threw his head and backed away, the whites showing all around his eyes, and for the first time since that first dawn, he looked truly dangerous. 1,800 pounds of panic looking for somewhere to put itself. "Stand back from the rail," Eli said quietly. "Slow, both of you. He's not seeing you right now. He's seeing whatever happened to him." They stepped back. Eli did not. He stayed at the rail loose and easy, the rope hanging slack from his hand, and he began to talk to the horse in a low, steady stream of nothing words, the kind of voice a man uses on a thing that is about to come apart. And Martha watched, and she understood that she was seeing Eli Boone do the thing he was put on the earth to do, and that there was a kind of grace in it she had not expected from a scarred man in worn-through clothes. "There it is," Eli murmured. "There it is. You're all right. Nobody here's going to hurt you. I know somebody did once. I know it, but not us. Not today." Slow, he raised one hand palm out and held it there, not reaching, just offering. "You want to show her. I know you do. That's why you came down all them mornings. You got something heavy, and you've been carrying it alone a long time, and you finally found somebody fool enough to carry it with you." The corner of his mouth moved. "Believe me, I know how that goes." The horse stopped pacing. His sides were heaving and lathered, but he stopped and his ears came forward by degrees, and he looked at Eli Boone with those wide dark eyes, and something passed between man and animal that Martha would not have believed if she had not watched it happen. "There," Eli breathed. "There. Now show us. Take us up to it. We're ready." And the great gray horse turned his head slow toward the hills above Mercy Hollow, and he started to walk. The going was hard, and it got harder. The higher they climbed the track, narrowing to a goat path, and then to no path at all, and the gray picked his way up ahead of them, as sure as if he had walked it 1,000 times, which Martha realized with a chill he very likely had. "He knows the way blind," Eli said quietly, leading his horse behind her. "Look at him. He's not searching. He's remembering." The heat came down hard as it climbed toward noon, and the 3 of them and the 3 horses moved up through the broken country in a silence, broken only by the click of shod hooves on stone and the buzz of flies, and underneath it all, the growing tightness in Martha's chest that told her they were getting close to something she could not take back. Twice the gray stopped dead. Both times it was at a place where the old track forked, and both times he stood trembling, looking down one fork with his ears pinned flat, and his whole body gone rigid before he turned and took the other. "He don't like that way," Caleb said the second time low. "Why's he so scared of that way?" "Because something happened to him on that way," Eli said. "Something he won't go near again." He studied the rejected fork, a darker, narrower cut that wound off down toward a fold in the hills. "Mark it. We may want to know where that goes before we're through." Martha marked it, and the cold thing in her chest grew colder. They came to the old workings a little after noon. She knew it before she saw it by the way the gray's whole body changed, the lift of his head, the quiver that ran the length of him, the low sound he made, not quite a whinny, a thing closer to a moan that raised the hair on Martha's arms. And then the ground opened before them, and there it was, the sealed shaft, the place 3 men had died 20 years gone, and the gray draft horse walked to the very edge of a narrow black crack in the earth and stopped and pawed once, twice hard, throwing up dust. And then he turned and looked back at Martha with those wide, terrible eyes, and the look said plain as any spoken word here, "It is here. I brought you. Now look." "God Almighty," Eli said softly, and took off his hat. It was Caleb who went down. They had not meant for it to be Caleb. Eli meant to go himself, but the crack was narrow, a body-width fissure in the rock where the old shaft had partly caved, and Eli was too broad through the shoulders to fit. Martha said she would go, and Eli said no, ma'am, and there was something final in it. And then Caleb stepped up before either of them could argue further. "I'm the smallest," he said, "and I'm not scared." He was lying about the second part. They all knew it. But he set his jaw, and Martha saw Thomas in him again, that same stubborn courage, and she could not refuse him without telling him he was still a boy, and she would not do that. Not after this morning. "You go slow," she said, gripping his arm hard. "You feel the rope go tight. You come right back up. You hear something move. You come back up. You promise me, Caleb." "I promise." They tied the rope around him under his arms, and Eli braced himself at the lip with the line wrapped twice around his forearm, and Martha lit the lantern and handed it down, and Caleb wedged himself into the black crack in the earth and began to disappear inch by inch into the place where men had died. For a while there was only the scrape of his boots and the rattle of dislodged stone, and the small sounds of his breathing coming up out of the dark, and the gray horse standing rigid at the lip of the fissure, watching, and Martha lying flat on her belly at the edge with her heart going like a hammer. "Caleb, talk to me. What do you see?" "Dark." His voice came up hollow and strange. "It opens up down here. There's the shaft kept going, the cave-in only got the top of it. There's a mama, there's room down here, a whole room." A pause. The lantern light moved below, throwing strange shadows up through the crack. "It smells bad. Real bad." "You come up if it's bad." "No, wait." His voice changed, sharpened. "There's something here. Hold the light steady, I can't—" A scrape, a long silence that stretched until Martha thought she would scream into it. "Caleb, Mama." His voice had gone very small and very strange. "Mama, there's bones down here." Eli's hands tightened on the rope. Martha pressed her face to the gap. "What kind of bones, son? Look careful. Could be an animal got down there and—" "It's a horse," Caleb said, and his voice was shaking now. "It's a horse, Mama, a big one, a draft horse. There's the bones are all, and there's a harness still on it, the leather's all dried up, but it's still—" A sharp intake of breath. "And there's something else. There's a box, an iron box all locked up half under it's chained to the harness rig. Somebody chained a strong box to this horse, and above them at the lip of the fissure, the gray draft horse threw back his head and screamed. It was a sound none of them would forget as long as they lived. Not a whinny, not a neigh, a scream raw and human in its grief, the sound of an animal looking down into a hole at the bones of something it had loved, and Martha understood in one sickening rush of comprehension what they had found, and why the gray had been too frightened to take the other fork, and what had happened on this hill 20 years ago. "Pull him up," she said. "Eli, pull him up, now." They got Caleb out, white-faced and shaking, and he came up out of the earth and sat down hard in the dust and put his head between his knees and breathed, and Martha knelt and held him, and over his bent head she met Eli's eyes. "2 horses," she said quietly. "That's what it is, isn't it? There were 2 of them, a team." Eli's face was grim. "A draft team, big grays. You'd use a pair like that to haul freight, or to haul something heavy you didn't want anybody to see you hauling." He looked at the gray standing, trembling at the fissure's edge. "That down there's his partner, his teammate. They'd have been raised together, worked together, stood in the same stall every night of their lives. A team like that, you split 'em up, they'll grieve like a widow. His jaw worked. Somebody chained a strong box to that horse and put it down a mine shaft. And this one, he nodded at the gray. This one got away. Or got left. And he's been carrying that around in his head for 20 years, and bringing the stones down to the one person who'd... 20 years, Caleb said, suddenly lifting his head. But Mama, how horses don't live. And there it was. The thing that did not fit. The cold thing that had been sitting in Martha's chest since the quarry came into view, finally given its name. A draft horse don't live but 20-25 years if he's lucky, Eli said slowly. And this one's no spring colt, but he's no 25 neither. He looked at the gray, and Martha watched the understanding move across his face like a shadow. He wasn't here 20 years ago. He's too young. Then how does he know? Caleb's voice cracked. How does he know where the bones are? Why's he so scared of that fork? If he wasn't even... Because it happened again, Martha said. The words came out of her flat and certain, and they stopped both of them cold. She got to her feet, slow, her knees stiff from kneeling, and she looked down into the black crack where her son had found the bones of a horse that died 20 years gone. And then she looked at the living gray, this gray too young by half to have been any part of it, and the whole terrible shape of it came clear to her all at once. It wasn't 20 years ago for him, she said. Whatever happened down there, whatever those men died for, whatever's in that box, somebody buried it 20 years back and thought it was buried for good. And then somebody came back. She turned to Eli. Recent. Within the year by the look of that horse's terror. Somebody came back to this hill with this horse to move what was hidden, and something went wrong, and this one got away, and he's been trying to lead somebody back to it ever since. The silence after she spoke was the loudest thing on that hill. Sweet Jesus, Eli said softly. You're saying somebody's still... I'm saying, Martha said, that whatever's in that strong box there is a man alive who knows it's up here, and who knows it's worth chaining a horse to and dropping down a hole, and who is going to come looking for it the moment he learns a widow and a boy and a half-mad gray have been seen climbing into these hills. Her voice did not shake. She was past shaking. We have to get that box out and get it down to where people can see it, today, before he comes back. But the box would not come. They tried for the better part of 2 hours, in the worst of the heat. Caleb went down again braver the second time, now that he knew the shape of the dark, and got a second rope around the strongbox, and the three of them and Eli's strongest saddle horse hauled until the rope sang, and the box did not move, because it was chained fast to the dead horse's harness rig, and the rig was pinned under a fall of rock that 20 years had cemented into the floor of the shaft. It's not coming, Caleb gasped, hauled up filthy and scraped and bleeding from one knuckle. Not without we cut the chain, and I can't get a swing in down there. There's no room, I tried. Then we bring tools, Eli said, wiping the sweat from his eyes. Bolt cutters, a longer pry. We mark this place, and we come back at first light with the right gear, and we... No. Martha was looking at the sun, which had slid well down the western sky, while they sweated and hauled. If we leave it and somebody's watching these hills, ma'am, we got no choice. We can't move it tonight. We'll lose the light before we're halfway down as it is, and breaking our necks on that track won't help anybody. Eli put a hand on her shoulder, and it was the first time he had touched her, and she was too tired and too frightened to mind. We come back at dawn. We tell nobody where we've been or what we found. We get the right tools and we get it done quick and quiet. That's the only way that doesn't get one of us killed. Martha wanted to argue. Every nerve in her body was screaming to get the thing out of the ground now tonight into the light where it could not be hidden again. But Eli was right, and she knew he was right, and so she made herself nod. Dawn, she said, and we tell no one. Not Pike, not Ruth Harlan, not a soul. They marked the place. They covered the fissure as best they could with brush so a casual eye would pass it by. And they started the long walk down, the three of them, and the gray who came willingly now, who walked down out of the hills, with his head lower and his step easier than Martha had ever seen it, as though setting down a part of the weight he had carried so long. She should have felt that ease. Instead, the cold thing in her chest had not loosened at all. It had grown, because she could not shake the feeling the whole way down that the hills had eyes, that somewhere in that broken country, a man was watching three figures and a gray draft horse come down off the workings, and was doing the same arithmetic she had done, and was reaching the same answer. She told herself it was nerves. She told herself it was the heat and the day and the bones. She was wrong. They came down into the flat behind Martha's house as the light went amber, and the first thing she saw was that her front door stood open. She had latched it. She always latched it. She latched it out of 3 years of habit, a woman alone with a son, and she had latched it that morning, and now it stood open, swinging slightly, and Martha's hand shot out and caught Caleb's arm and stopped him cold. "Mama, I latched that door," she said very quietly. "This morning, I latched it." Eli stepped past them both, smooth and silent, and his hand had drifted to the old pistol at his hip without her quite seeing it move. "Stay back," he said. "Both of you. Stay with the horses." He went up to the open door. He stood to the side of it listening, and then he pushed it wide with the barrel of his pistol and went in low, and there was a long, terrible silence, and then his voice came back out flat and careful. "Ain't nobody here, but you best come see this ma'am." Martha went in, and she stopped on her own threshold and felt the blood drain out of her face. The house had been searched. Not robbed, searched. Every drawer of the bureau stood open, the bedding torn off the floorboards she had not even known were loose pried up at one corner of the room. Her sewing basket was overturned, the spools rolled across the floor. The little tin where she kept her $11 sat open and empty on the table, but beside it, untouched, lay her mother's silver thimble. The only thing of value she owned, the thing any common thief would have taken first. A thief takes the silver. This was not a thief. This was a man looking for something particular. A man who did not care about silver thimbles or $11, except as an afterthought. A man looking for 7 white stones, or for whatever a widow might have found, or for some sign of how much she knew. And on the table, set square in the middle where she could not miss it, weighting down a torn scrap of paper, sat a single white quarry stone, not one of hers. Hers were lined up on the windowsill, all 7 untouched. This was an 8th. He had brought his own. He had set it on her table like a calling card, like a man laying down a card in a game, and on the scrap of paper beneath it, in a hard, cramped hand, were 5 words. Martha picked it up. Her hand was steady. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at Eli and Caleb, and her voice, when it came, was very quiet and very cold. "He knows," she said. "He was here while we were up on that hill. He knows we found it." "What's it say?" Caleb whispered. Martha looked down at the 5 words and read them aloud. "Some things stay buried, widow." Nobody slept that night, and there was no question now of waiting for dawn. "He's going for the box," Eli said. They had pulled the table against the door, and Eli sat with his back to the wall and his pistol across his knee and the lamp burning low, money be damned. "He came here looking to find out what we knew. He found a torn-up house and 7 stones on a windowsill, and he knows exactly what that means. By now, he's putting it together same as we did, that we found the workings, that the box is still chained down, and we couldn't move it. He'll figure we mean to go back at first light." Eli looked at the black window. "Which means he means to be there first." "Then we go now," Martha said. "In the dark. Up that track." Eli shook his head. "We'd break our necks, and even if we didn't, we'd never find that fisher under brush in the black. No, we go at first light same as planned, but we go ready." He looked at her, and there was something grim and certain in his scarred face. "Ma'am, I need to ask you something, and I need a true answer. That note, that hand. Does anybody in this town write like that you know anybody you'd know to look for?" Martha shook her head slowly. "No, it's no hand I know." but Caleb, who had been sitting silent and white in the corner, suddenly lifted his head. "I know it," he said. They both turned to him. "Not the writing," Caleb said. "The words. Some things stay buried." He swallowed. "There's a freight hauler comes through every few months. Hauls for the mine company over to Crown Ridge, sells off goods cheap on the side. Big man, black coat, white hair, though he's not old. Silas his name is. Silas Crow." Caleb's voice dropped. "He was through about 10 days back, right before the stones started. I remember 'cause he stopped me on the road and asked me, did anybody ever go up into the old workings anymore? I thought it was nothing. I told him no, nobody'd been up there in years, and he said—" Caleb's face went gray. "He said, good. Some things stay buried." And he smiled at me and drove on. The lamp hissed. Outside, far off, a coyote cried and went still. 10 days back," Eli said softly. "Right before the gray started bringing stones. He came back," Martha said. The cold thing in her chest had a name now, a name and a black coat and white hair. "He came back to move what he hid. That's what spooked the horse. That's why the gray's been half mad with terror these 10 days. Silas Crow came back to this hill and brought a draft horse to haul the box out, and something went wrong. The horse bolted, or wouldn't go near that fork, or saw what was down in the dark, and Crow couldn't get it done. And the horse got loose and came down off that hill and found the one house in Mercy Hollow where somebody'd—" Her voice caught. She steadied it. "And now Crow knows we found it. And he's not going to let a widow and a boy and a hired man take it down into the light. Not after 20 years. Not when he's already buried men to keep it quiet once. Twice," Eli said quietly. She looked at him. "You said it yourself, ma'am. The bones down there are 20 years old. But this gray's no older than 10. So the team he murdered to chain that box wasn't the team from the collapse." Eli's jaw was tight. "He did it once 20 years back when the shaft went down, and 3 men died for whatever's in that box. And he came back this year and did it again, fresh team, fresh chain, meaning to move the box somewhere even harder to find. And this gray's the only living witness to either time. The one that got away." He looked toward the dark window toward the hills. "No wonder the man wants him dead. No wonder he wants us all dead. We're standing next to the only creature on God's earth that can lead a body straight to 20 years of his sins." Martha was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood and crossed to the window and looked out at the dark shape of the gray standing patient in the yard where he had refused to leave, and she put her hand flat against the cool glass. "Then we don't fail him," she said. 20 years he's tried to tell somebody. The first horse died trying to keep that secret in the ground. This one near died trying to dig it back up. She turned around, and her face in the lamplight was a face neither her son nor Eli Boone had seen on her before. Not the worn-down widow, not the town's whispered-about strangeness, but something harder and brighter, something that had been buried itself for 3 long years, and was finally clawing its way up into the light. "At first light we go up that hill," Martha Calloway said. "All 3 of us. And we bring that box down into the sun where the whole of Mercy Hollow can see what's been hid from them. And if Silas Crow is waiting up there—" Her hand closed slowly into a fist at her side. "Then he's going to learn what I have spent 3 years learning the hard way. That you can call a woman strange, and you can turn your back on her, and you can search her house and leave your ugly little notes on her table. But you cannot bury the truth in a person who has already lost everything and lived. There's nothing left in me for a man like that to threaten." The lamp burned low between them. Outside, the gray horse lifted his great head toward the black line of the hills and stood his silent watch and waited as he had waited 20 years for the dawn. They left before the sun cleared the ridge in the gray half-light, when a man can see the shape of a thing but not its face, and they went up the hill armed. Eli had his pistol and a long iron pry-bar slung across his saddle, and a pair of heavy bolt cutters he'd taken off the wall at the livery without asking Ruth Harlan's leave because there had been no time and no good way to explain. Caleb carried Jeremiah Pike's miner's pick, and Martha carried her late husband's rifle loaded, now the weight of it no longer strange in her hands because she had sat up half the night learning again how to hold it the way Thomas had once taught her, back when the world had been a kinder shape. The gray led them the same as before, picking the track sure-footed in the dimness. But this morning he was different. This morning he climbed fast and tense, his ears working, his head swinging, and twice he stopped and stood rigid with his nostrils flared wide, testing the air. And both times Eli reined in and held up a hand, and they all went still as stones, until the gray decided it was safe and moved on. "He smells something," Eli said low the second time. "Or he remembers something. Hard to say which with him. But he don't like this morning. He don't like it at all." "Neither do I," Martha said. They came up over the last rise to the workings, just as the sun broke, and the gray stopped dead, and a sound came out of him low in his chest, and Martha looked where the horse was looking, and her heart turned over in her chest. The brush they had piled over the fissure was thrown aside, scattered. And in the dust around the black crack in the earth fresh that morning were boot prints and the deep churned marks of horses. 2 horses, a heavy team, and the long-dragged gouges of something heavy hauled across the ground. "He's here," Eli breathed. "We're too late. He's all ready." "No?" Martha was off her horse before she knew she'd moved the rifle, coming up her eyes going to the fissure. "No, look. Look at the box." Because the strong box was there, hauled up out of the crack, sitting in the dust at the lip of the fissure, the cut chain still trailing from it where Crow had done in 20 minutes with proper tools, what they had failed to do in 2 hours. But it was still here. He had gotten it out of the ground, and then he left it. Why would he get it out and leave it sitting here in the open? "Because he ain't gone," said a voice. He came out from behind the spoil heap where he had been waiting, and he came out unhurried, a big man in a black coat with white hair that did not match his young hard face, and he had a long-barreled pistol in his hand, and it was already up, already pointed, and Martha understood that they had walked into the exact place he had wanted them, the way you herd cattle into a pen. "Mornin'," said Silas Crow. Nobody moved. The gray had gone rigid as iron. At the sound of that voice, every muscle locked, and Martha saw the whites of his eyes ringing all the way around, and she understood that the horse knew. This man knew him to the marrow, and that whatever had been done to him on this hill had been done by the man now standing 20 feet away with a gun. "Now I want everybody to be real still," Crow said pleasantly. "And I want everybody to keep their hands where I can see 'em. You especially, friend." This last to Eli, whose hand had drifted toward his hip and now went still. "I seen you reach. You reach again. I'll put one through the boy first. You understand me?" "I understand you," Eli said, very quiet. "Good." Crow's eyes moved over the 3 of them and settled on Martha, and a slow, ugly smile crawled up his face. "So you're the widow, the one the whole town's been clucking about, the witch with the cursed horse." He laughed short and hard. "Hell, ma'am, you're just a seamstress. Look at you. I've been losing sleep over a seamstress and her boy and some saddle tramp." He shook his head. "And this damned horse." "He's why you're losing sleep," Martha said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Isn't it? That horse. You can't sleep because of what he knows." Crow's smile flickered just slightly. "A horse don't know anything, lady. He knew where the bones were," Martha said. "He led us right to them, right to the box you chained to his partner and dropped down that hole. He's been bringing the proof down off this hill, 1 stone at a time, for 10 days, because you couldn't get him to haul it for you, could you? He wouldn't go near that fork. He bolted on you, and he came down off this mountain and found me." She did not look away from him. "So don't you tell me a horse don't know anything. That horse knows more about what you are than the whole of Mercy Hollow put together." The smile was gone now. Crow's face had gone flat and cold, and that was worse. That was much worse, and Eli shifted his weight a fraction, putting himself by inches between the gun and the boy. "You talk a lot for a woman about to disappear," Crow said. 20 years, Eli said. He said it calm and easy, the way he talked to a horse about to come apart, and Martha understood at once what he was doing, because Crow's eyes flicked to him, and a gun that is looking at one man is not looking at the others. 20 years that box has been down that hole. Eli went on his voice level, his hands open and still at his sides. 3 men died in that collapse, or that's what the town buried. But it weren't no collapse, was it? You brought it down on purpose, on them. You don't know one thing about it, Crow said. I know there's mine deeds in that box, Eli said, and I'd wager gold by the weight of it. I know 3 men owned a claim with you 20 years back, and I know all 3 of them ended up under a mountain, and I know you been the only one walking around spending easy ever since. He tilted his head. How am I doing, Crow? Crow's jaw worked. The gun did not move. They were going to sell, he said, and the words came out of him before he could stop them. A man who had carried a thing alone for 20 years, finding like the horse that he could not hold it forever. We hit the vein, and they wanted to sell out to the company for pennies because they were scared. Scared. I had a fortune in my hand, and 3 frightened old women wanted to give it away. So He stopped himself, his mouth closed like a trap. So you brought the roof down on 'em, Eli finished softly, and buried the deeds with them, so nobody could ever prove the claim was theirs. And then you waited, 20 years, till everybody forgot. And this spring you came back to dig it up quiet and cash it in. His eyes went for just a flicker to the gray. Only the horse you brought to haul it wouldn't have it. Bolted on you, got loose, and you've been hunting him for 10 days while he was busy hunting the one person who'd listen. That horse, Crow said, and now there was something raw under the cold. Something that frightened Martha more than the gun is going down that hole with the rest of it, where it should have gone the first time. It happened fast, then the way these things do faster than any of them could have planned for. The gray lunged. He had been winding tighter and tighter through every word 1,800 pounds of remembered terror and 20 years of grief. And when Crow said down that hole, something in the animal broke its chain. He lunged not away toward straight at the man in the black coat, the man who had murdered his partner and chained the proof of it to the dead horse's harness, and tried to do the same to him. And he came with his ears flat and his teeth bared, and a scream tearing out of him that was pure 20-year rage. Crow swung the gun toward the horse, and Martha, without a thought in her head, without deciding anything at all, brought up Thomas's rifle and fired. She was no marksman. She had not meant to kill him, and she did not. The shot went wide and high, smashing into the spoil heap a foot from Crow's head. But it did the one thing that mattered, which was that it made him flinch, made the pistol jerk skyward as it fired the bullet screaming off into nothing. And in that half-second of flinch, the gray was on him. The horse hit Silas Crow like a freight wagon. Crow went down under the animal with a sound Martha would hear in her sleep for years, and the gun spun away across the rock, and then it was chaos dust and screaming, and the gray rearing, and coming down, rearing, and coming down. 20 years of it, and Crow rolling and scrambling and trying to get clear of those hooves. Caleb the gun. Eli was already moving, lunging for the spinning pistol, and Caleb broke from his frozen terror and dove for it too, and the 2 of them came up with it between them just as Crow got clear of the horse and got his feet under him and turned and froze. Because Eli Boone was standing 6 feet away, with Crow's own pistol in his hand, leveled and steady, and behind him Martha had the rifle up again, and the boy had the pick raised in white-knuckled hands, and the gray stood heaving and lathered between them, all putting himself square in front of Martha, guarding her a wall of trembling gray muscle that had finally, after 20 years, gotten to stand against the man, instead of running from him. "It's done, Crow," Eli said. He was breathing hard, but his hand was rock steady. "It's over. 20 years, and it ends right here on this hill in the open in the daylight, with 3 witnesses and the box up out of the ground." His voice dropped. "Get down on your knees." Crow stood swaying. There was blood on his face from where a hoof had caught him, and his black coat was torn and gray with dust, and his eyes moved from the pistol to the rifle to the pick to the horse doing the arithmetic, and Martha watched him do it. "You won't shoot," Crow said. But he didn't sound sure. "Hired man like you. You shoot me, you hang. Self-defense don't cover a man with his hands empty." "My hands ain't the ones you should worry about," Eli said quietly, and he tipped his head just slightly toward the gray. For a long moment, nothing moved on that hill but the dust settling and the heaving sides of the horse. Then Silas Crow did the thing that desperate men do, the thing Eli had been watching for. He went for the second gun. Nobody had known there was a second gun. It was a small one, a hideaway tucked at the small of his back under the black coat, and his hand went for it fast and smooth. A man who had killed before and meant to kill again. And he had it half drawn and swinging up toward Martha, not Eli, because even now, even cornered, the man's instinct was to put down the one who listened, the one who would not let it stay buried. The gray took him. The horse had not stopped watching Crow's hands. Some animal wisdom, older than language, had kept those dark eyes locked on the man. And when the hand moved, the gray moved with it faster than anything that size had a right to move. And he came down on Silas Crow with both front hooves, as the little gun came up, and the shot went into the dirt, and Crow went down, and this time he did not get up. It was very quiet after. The gray stood over the fallen man, trembling, his head low, his sides working like a bellows, and then slowly, the rage went out of him. Martha watched it leave. She watched the killer drain out of the animal and leave only the thing underneath, the grieving thing, the frightened thing, the creature that had carried this for 20 years and had finally set it down. The horse lifted his head and looked at the man at his feet, and then he turned away, as though Silas Crow were no longer worth the watching, and he walked the few steps to where Martha stood and pressed his great head against her chest and stood there shaking. Martha lowered the rifle. She put both arms around the horse's enormous head and held him. "It's done," she whispered into his neck. "You hear me? It's done. You don't have to carry it anymore. You did it. You brought the truth all the way down out of the dark, and you made me listen, and it's done." Silas Crow was not dead. Eli found a pulse and bound the man's hands with the cut chain that had held the strongbox, and they propped him against the spoil heap, broken and groaning, and conscious enough to know that 20 years had ended for him on a summer morning at the hands of a horse. And while Eli watched the prisoner, Martha and Caleb knelt over the strongbox. It was locked, but the fall down the shaft and 20 years of rust had done what no key could, and the lid had sprung at one corner. Eli's pry bar finished it. The lid groaned back, and the three of them looked down into 20 years of buried truth. There was gold. Coin and dust, both more money than Martha had ever seen or imagined enough to murder twice for. But it was not the gold that made Martha's breath catch. It was what lay beneath it. Papers. Mine deeds. 3 of them. The ink faded but legible, and each one bore a name. 3 names. 3 men's names. The rightful owners of a claim that had made one man rich for 20 years over their bones. And folded beneath the deeds, brittle and water-stained, a letter. "What's it say?" Caleb whispered. Martha lifted it careful, so it would not crumble, and she read it, and her hand began to shake, and Eli looked over from his prisoner and said, "Ma'am, what is it?" "It's a confession," Martha said softly. She could barely get the words out. "One of them. One of the 3 men. He must have known, he must have suspected what Crow meant to do, and he wrote it all down and hid it in the box with the deeds as a hedge against exactly this." She looked up, her eyes wet. "He names Crow. He names him plain. He writes that if anything happens to the 3 of them, it was Silas Crow did it, and that the truth is here in this box for whoever's brave enough to dig it up." Her voice broke. "He's been waiting 20 years for somebody to read it. They all have." And from his place against the spoil heap, Silas Crow began horribly to laugh, a wet, broken laugh that was half a sob. 20 years, he croaked. 20 years I had it. 20 years nobody so much as climbed this hill. And it's a seamstress and a horse. He let his bloodied head fall back. A horse brought you stones, and you listened. Nobody listens. That's the whole thing of it. Nobody ever listens. His eyes, when they found Martha's, were almost wondering. "Why'd you listen?" Martha folded the brittle confession closed and held it against her heart, and she looked at the man who had murdered 5 men and 2 horses to keep a hill quiet, and she did not hate him in that moment. She only pitied him, and the pity was worse than hate, and they both knew it. "Because I know what it is," she said quietly, "to carry a true thing in a town that would rather you stayed silent. I have spent 3 years being looked through and whispered about, and told I was strange for the crime of being alone." She stroked the gray's neck. "And so when something came to my door that nobody else would hear, I knew it. I knew it the first morning. It takes one to know one, Mr. Crow. The difference between that horse and you is that he carried the truth down off the mountain, and you spent 20 years carrying it back up. That's the whole of it. That's the only difference between a witness and a murderer. Which way you carry the thing you know." Crow had no answer for that. He turned his face away. They got him down off the hill. It was a long, grim business, hauling a bound and broken man down that track in the climbing heat, draped over Eli's saddle horse, with Eli leading, and the pistol never far from his hand, and Martha and Caleb behind with the strongbox lashed to the second horse, and the gray walking last of all, free and unburdened, his head high. They were halfway down when they met the town coming up. Ruth Harlan was at the front of them on a mule with a shotgun across her saddle and a face like a thundercloud, and behind her came a dozen men of Mercy Hollow. And Martha's heart sank because she knew this town, and she had braced herself for them to side with the prosperous freight hauler over the widow and the saddle tramp, the way they had sided against her every day for 3 years. But Ruth Harlan was not looking at Martha. She was looking at the man bound over Eli's saddle, and at the strongbox, and at the gray walking free and easy behind, and something complicated was working across her hard old face. "Mrs. Calloway," Ruth reined in. "We heard shots. Heard 'em clear down in the hollow at first light, and Jeremiah Pike come banging on my door near out of his mind saying he'd told the boy about the quarry, and now you'd all gone up there, and there was shooting and—" She stopped. Her eyes went to Crow, to the blood on him, to the chain at his wrists. What in God's name happened up on that hill? And Jeremiah Pike pushed his mule up beside her, 72 years old and white-faced, and he looked at the strongbox lashed to the horse. And Martha watched 20 years move across the old man's face. "That's it," the old man whispered. "That's the box, ain't it? I knew it. God forgive me. I knew there was something. I always knew that collapse weren't right, and I never said one word. I let it stay buried because it was easier." His voice cracked clean in two. 3 good men. And I held my tongue 20 years. "You hold it no longer," Martha said gently. "None of us do. It's all here, Mr. Pike. The deeds, the gold, and a confession written by one of the men himself naming Silas Crow for what he did." She held up the brittle paper so the whole town could see it. "It's done. It's out of the ground. There's not a soul in Mercy Hollow can call it ghost stories now." The town went very still. And then Silas Crow, bound and broken over the saddle, lifted his head and made his last play, because a man like that always has one more. "They're lying," he rasped. "The widow and her tramp. They robbed me, killed my beat me near to death, and now they're spinning you a tale about you all know her. You know what she is. The strange widow with the cursed horse. You gonna take her word over." He never finished, because the gray draft horse, who had stood silent and easy this whole while, walked forward through the crowd of men and stopped beside the horse that carried Silas Crow, and he turned his great head, and he looked at the bound man with those dark, deep eyes, and he made a sound low and long and grieving, and every man in Mercy Hollow, who heard it, went cold to the bone. There was no mistaking it. There is a thing animals do that goes underneath all the lies men tell, and the whole town heard it in that sound, and the whole town understood it, and Silas Crow's voice died in his throat under the weight of a witness no jury would need explain to them. Ruth Harlan looked at the horse a long moment. Then she looked at Martha, and at the boy, and at the scarred, quiet man holding the prisoner, and at the box of 20-year-old truth. She took off her hat. It was a small thing. But Ruth Harlan had not bared her head to anyone in Martha's memory, and she did it now slow in front of the whole assembled town, and the men behind her saw her do it, and one by one, raggedly, they did the same. "Mrs. Calloway," Ruth said, and her voice was rough. "I believe this town owes you an apology that's 20 years and a good deal more besides overdue. And I believe—" She looked at the gray, and something in her hard face came apart and softened. "I believe we owe that horse one even bigger." Martha stood in the middle of the track with the confession in her hand, and her son at her side and the scarred man at her back and the great gray horse beside her. The horse the town had called a monster. The horse that had carried the truth down out of the dark to the one soul who would listen. And for the first time in 3 long years, the whole of Mercy Hollow was looking at Martha Calloway with bared heads, and not a single whisper among them. She did not weep. She had wept already on her porch in the dawn, when it was only her and the horse and 7 white stones. This was not a moment for weeping. She reached up and laid her hand on the gray's neck, and she felt him lean into it, warm and trembling, and finally unafraid. "Take him down easy," she said to the men nodding at Crow. "Lock him up tight. There'll be a marshal wanted from the county seat, and a judge and the families of 3 murdered men to find and to tell." Her hand stayed on the horse. "And somebody fetch a wagon up here gentle, because there's bones down that shaft that have waited 20 years to be brought up into the light and buried Christian. And we are not leaving this hill until every last one of them is." They brought the bones down off the hill that same day, and the whole town stayed to do it. That was the first thing that told Martha the world had truly turned. Not one of those men went home. They rigged a sling and lowered a man down into the shaft. Young Tom Avery, the dry goods man's nephew, who had thrown a rock at Caleb a week before, and who now would not meet the boy's eye, and one by one they brought up what was left of 2 draft horses that had died 20 years and a season apart, and they laid the bones gentle in a wagon bed lined with clean straw that Ruth Harlan herself had fetched up the hill. Nobody complained about the heat. Nobody complained about the work. They did it with their hats off and their voices low, and Martha understood that a town carries its guilt the same way a person does in the body, and that these men needed to lift those bones with their own hands to set down something they had been carrying without ever naming it. Jeremiah Pike worked alongside them, though his knees would barely hold him, and twice Martha had to take his arm, and the second time the old man looked at her with eyes swimming. "I knew Henry Calloway," he said suddenly. Martha went still. "My husband's father." "No, ma'am. Henry Calloway, your husband's uncle. Thomas's people. He was one of the 3. Pike's voice shook. "One of the 3 men murdered on this hill 20 years gone was kin to your Thomas. Did you not know that?" Martha had not known. She stood in the churned dust with the old man's words going through her like cold water, and she turned to look at the wagon at the bones at the strongbox, and the whole strange shape of it settled over her at last that the horse had not chosen her by accident. That some thread ran back through 20 years and a dead husband's bloodline to this hill and that. When the gray came down off the mountain, looking for the one soul in Mercy Hollow who would listen, he had found the widow of a man whose own kin lay murdered in that shaft. "He came to the right door," Martha said softly. "Of all the doors in this valley, he came to the right one." "I'd call that God's hand," Jeremiah Pike said, "if I had the right to call on him after 20 years of silence." "You've got the right," Martha said, and she took the old man's ruined hand in both of hers. "A man who breaks his silence has every right there is. It's the ones who stay quiet that lose it." The marshal came up from the county seat. 3 days later, a lean, weathered man named Dawes, who had heard enough strange tales in his years to take this one in stride. He read the confession. He counted the gold. He spread the 3 deeds out on Ruth Harlan's table and matched the names against the county claims book. And when he was done, he sat back and looked at Martha for a long moment. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I have been a lawman 26 years, and I have never once closed a murder that was 20 years cold on the word of a horse." A dry flicker crossed his face. "But I have the deeds, and I have the gold, and I have a written confession in a dead man's hand, and I have a prisoner who's already said more than his lawyer would like. So I will tell you plain Silas Crow is going to hang, and there's not a thing his money can do about it, because it was never his money. It belonged to 3 murdered men, and now it belongs to whatever family they left." "They left family?" Martha asked. "That's the part I came to tell you." Dawes folded the deeds careful. Henry Calloway died without wife or child. His share goes to his nearest blood kin. He looked at her. Which Mrs. Calloway, the county clerk, tells me is your son. The room went silent. Caleb, who had been standing by the door, went white. Me, you son. Dawes almost smiled. By the time the court's done dividing it 3 ways and the families of the other 2 are found and paid, you'll not be rich. But you'll not be poor neither. There's enough in Henry Calloway's third to keep a roof over your mother's head and put you into a trade or a school or whatever an honest young man wants of his life. He stood and settled his hat. Strange world. A horse brings a widow a stone, and a boy comes into his inheritance 20 years late. I have given up trying to make sense of it. I just write it down. Martha sat down slowly. After 3 years of counting coins of 30 cents a shirt, of choosing between her own supper and her son's, she found she could not quite take hold of it. She looked at Caleb, and Caleb looked at her, and neither of them had words. It was Caleb who finally spoke, and what he said undid her completely. I don't want a school, he said. His voice was steady. I don't want to go off anywhere. I want to stay here with you, and I want... He swallowed. I want to learn horses, from Mr. Boone, if he'll teach me. He looked at his mother, 16 and certain. There's nothing in any city I want more than I want to know how he does what he does with that gray, how he talks to a thing that's been hurt and gets it to trust again. That's what I want to learn, Mama. That's the only thing. And Martha, who had braced herself to one day lose her son to a wider world, found that the wider world had come to them, and that her boy wanted nothing of it but the same hill and the same horses and the same scarred, quiet man. And she put her hand over her mouth and could not speak at all. The town changed toward her the way thaw comes to a hard country slow, and then all at once. It began with Edna Avery, of all people, who had called the horse an omen and the widow a witch in the same breath only a week before. She came to Martha's door on a morning, twisting her apron in her hands, and she stood on the sinking porch where the 7 stones had fallen, and she could not look Martha in the face. My grandmother's wedding dress, Edna said at last in a rush. It wants taking in, the seams. I'd pay proper, same as anybody. She forced herself to look up. And I'd pay double Mrs. Calloway for what I said. About you. I'd pay double if it'd buy it back, but it won't. So I'll pay double for the dress. Martha looked at her a long moment. There was a hardness in her that wanted to shut the door. 3 years of Edna Avery's whispers had earned that hardness fair. But she had been on the wrong side of a town's judgment too long to deal it out herself, and so she held the door open instead. Same as anybody, Edna, she said quietly. 30 cents. Bring the dress in and we'll see about the seams. Edna Avery's face crumpled, and she nodded fast, and she went, and that was the first of them. After her came others. They came with mending, and they came with apologies they didn't know how to make, and they came some of them with nothing but a tipped hat and a mornin'. Mrs. Calloway said to her face in the street, where for 3 years there had been only whispers at her back. Martha took the mending, and she took the tipped hats, and she let the apologies go unspoken, because she understood that a town's shame is a heavy thing, and that making a person grovel for it only spreads the hurt around. But she did not forget. That was the thing she promised herself. She would forgive Mercy Hollow, because forgiveness was the only way to live in a place. But she would not forget what it was to be the one looked through, and she would never again look through anyone herself. Silas Crow asked to see her before they took him to the county seat for trial. She had not expected it, and Eli was against it, and Dawes the marshal raised an eyebrow, but Martha went, because there was a thing she needed to understand, and she did not think she could learn it anywhere but from the man himself. They had him in the back room of the freight office, which had no proper jail chained to an iron ring set in the wall. He looked smaller than he had on the hill. Men always did. Martha had noticed once the thing that drove them was taken away. He watched her come in with those flat eyes, and there was no fight left in them, only a kind of exhausted curiosity. Come to gloat, he said. No. Then what? Martha sat down across from him, careful out of reach of the chain. I came to ask you one thing, Mr. Crow, and then I'll leave you be. She folded her hands. The horse, the gray. This spring, when you brought him up the hill to haul the box, what did you do to him? Because that animal has carried a terror these 10 days that no ordinary fright accounts for. What did you do? For a long moment she thought he would not answer. Then something in his face gave way, the way a wall gives way, and he told her. He wouldn't haul it, Crow said dully. I bought a team off a horse trader in Crown Ridge, 2 big grays, and I brought 'em up to pull the box out and move it somewhere the deeds couldn't ever be matched. But the one? He nodded vaguely, as though the gray were in the room. The one smelled the other. The dead one, down the shaft. 20 years dead, and he smelled his own kind down there. And he knew somehow, and he wouldn't go near the fork that led to it. Planted his feet and screamed and wouldn't be moved. Crow's mouth twisted. So I did to the other one what I'd done before. The one that would haul. I chained the box to him and... He stopped. And put him down the shaft, Martha said. Her voice was very quiet. Alive. It was deep, Crow said, and for the first time his voice was not flat. There was something underneath it, something he had been carrying. The box was heavy, and the chain when it went over the edge, it took the horse with it. I never meant for the animal to go down living, but the chain caught, and he went over, and the gray saw it. The gray saw his teammate go down the hole, and he tore loose from me, and he ran, and I couldn't catch him, and I have been hunting that horse 10 days because I knew. I knew that if anybody ever looked into those eyes and thought to ask why, he could not finish. Martha sat very still. So that was the second horse. Not 20 years gone with the first 3 men. But this spring, this very season, chained living to a strongbox and dropped into the dark while his brother watched. That was the terror the gray had carried down off the mountain. Not an old grief, but a fresh one, raw as an open wound. The memory of watching the only creature he loved in the world dragged screaming into a hole by a man in a black coat. You buried him alive, she said. And you'd have done the same to this one, and to my son, and to me. I'd have done the same to anybody, Crow said, and there was no defiance in it now, only a terrible weariness. That's what 20 years does, Mrs. Calloway. You bury one thing, and to keep it buried, you gotta bury the next and the next. It don't stop. You can't ever stop once you start, because every soul that gets close is one more shovelful. He lifted his chained hands a few inches and let them fall. Until a horse brings a widow a stone, and she does the one thing nobody in 20 years had the decency to do. She listens. He looked at her, and his eyes were wet, which she had not expected and did not want. I almost wish you hadn't. And I almost can't tell you how glad I am you did. Ain't that a thing, both at once? Martha stood. She had what she had come for, and it was worse than she had imagined, and she found she could not hate him even now because she had seen the shape of how a man becomes what Silas Crow had become. One buried truth at a time. One shovelful at a time, until the burying is all there is. I hope you find a way to set it down before the end, she said from the door, the way the horse did. It's a terrible thing to carry to the gallows. She did not wait for his answer. There wasn't one he could give. They buried the horses on a morning when the heat broke just enough to bear it. Eli had chosen the place a rise near the foot of the workings, under a great old cottonwood, the only real shade in that hard country, and he and Caleb and a half-dozen men of the town had dug the graves deep and wide. They brought the bones down wrapped in clean canvas, both of them, the one 20 years dead, and the one dead since spring, and they laid them in the earth side by side, the way they had stood side by side in the stall every night of their lives, the team that had been broken apart by a man's greed and was now at last put back together. The whole town came. That was the thing Martha would remember longest. The whole of Mercy Hollow climbed that hill in the summer heat to bury 2 horses with their hats in their hands, because they understood at last that they were not only burying animals. They were burying 20 years of looking away. They were burying every whisper and every turned back and every easy lie that some things stay buried. They had let it stay buried, all of them, and now they stood in the sun and bore witness while it was finally set right. Jeremiah Pike said words over the graves. Not a preacher's words. He was no preacher, but an old quarryman's words plain and broken, and he named the 3 murdered men, and he named the 2 horses, though no one had ever known the horses' names, and he asked forgiveness for a town that had stayed silent, and there was not a dry eye on that hill when he was done. And then Martha came forward with the 7 white stones. She had brought them down from her windowsill, the 7 the gray had carried to her door across 7 dawns, and she knelt at the head of the grave, and she laid them out one by one in a row, the way the horse had laid them at her feet, and her hands did not shake. "You carried these to me," she said low, so that only the nearest could hear, though she was not truly speaking to them. "One every morning, when nobody else in this whole valley would hear what you had to say. You carried the truth down out of the dark, a stone at a time, because that was all you could do, and you did it, and it was enough." She set the last stone in its place. "So I'm bringing them back to where they belong. To him. To the one you couldn't save." She rested her hand a moment on the turned earth. "You're not carrying it anymore. Neither of you. It's down in the light now where it can rest." And the gray who had stood the whole while at the edge of the gathering free and unhaltered came forward through the crowd of people who had once feared him and now parted to let him pass, and he walked to the graves of his brother and the one who came before, and he lowered his great head, and he stood there a long while, very still, in the cottonwood shade. It was after, as the town filed back down the hill, that the thing happened which Martha had stopped letting herself hope for. The gray turned from the graves and came to her the way he had come to her on the porch that last dawn, and he pressed his head against her chest. And Martha put her arms around him. And then slow she raised one hand and laid it flat against the broad, flat plane of his face, between those dark, deep eyes, in the place a horse will not let you touch unless he has decided all the way down that you will not hurt him. He let her. For the first time since the first stone fell, the great gray horse, the whole town had called a monster, let a human hand rest on his face without a tremor, without the whites of his eyes showing, without flinching from the memory of every cruel hand that had come before. He stood in the cottonwood shade with Martha Calloway's hand on his face, and he let his eyes half close, and he breathed slow and easy, and the last of the terror went out of him there in the heat of the summer morning and did not come back. "There," Martha whispered. And now finally the tears came, but they were a different kind than she had wept on the porch. "There you are. There you are." Eli came to stand beside her. He did not say anything for a while. He just watched the horse let itself be touched, and there was something working in his scarred face, some old wound of his own that Martha had never asked about, and he had never offered. "I broke 100 horses," Eli said at last, quiet. "More. And I never once seen one come back from a thing that deep. Once they're hurt that bad, mostly they're hurt for good. You can gentle 'em enough to use, but the fear never leaves. It just goes quiet, and waits." He shook his head slowly. "I'd have told you this one was past saving. The first day I'd have told you that. Kindest thing'd be a bullet, I'd have said." "What changed your mind?" "You did, ma'am." He looked at her, and there was no horsebreaker's distance in it now. "I watched a whole town call a thing a monster and turn their backs, and I watched one woman who'd been called the same look at it and see something worth saving. And I thought—" He stopped, started again slower. "I thought a man could do worse than to stand near a woman like that. A man who'd been hurt his own self and gone quiet and been waiting." His hand rose, and he touched the brim of his hat, that small old gesture, but his eyes did not leave her face. If she'd let him. Martha's hand stilled on the horse's face. She had not let herself think of it. 3 years a widow, judged and whispered about, she had walled off that part of herself, the way you board up a room you can't afford to heat. But she stood now in the cottonwood shade, with a healed horse under her hand, and a scarred good man at her side, and a town behind her that had finally bared its head, and she felt the boards over that room loosen just slightly, the way the gray had let her touch his face. "I might," she said. She did not look at him. She kept her hand on the horse and her eyes on the hills, but the corner of her mouth moved. A woman might let him. In time. If he was patient. Now she did look at him. "I've had my fill of men in a hurry, but a patient one." The smile came slow and real, the first true smile Eli Boone had seen on her. A patient one might find the door wasn't locked so tight as he feared. Eli Boone looked at her a long moment. Then he looked at the horse, and at the boy waiting down the slope, and at the graves under the cottonwood, and he nodded once, slow like a man who had just been handed something he'd long since stopped expecting. "I can do patient, ma'am," he said. "I broke horses 20 years. Patient's about the only thing I'm any good at." And the gray between them lifted his head and looked down the long slope toward Mercy Hollow, toward the town that no longer feared him, toward the home where 7 dawns of stones had finally been answered, and he made a low sound, easy and content. A sound none of them had heard from him before, the sound of an animal that has at last come all the way home. The summer wore on, and the gray healed the way Eli had said such things never heal all the way through. He ate again. That was the first sign, and it came faster than any of them dared hope. Within a week of the burial under the cottonwood, the great gray horse was cleaning out his feed and pushing his nose into the bucket for more, and the ribs that had stood out under his hide for 10 days began slow to fill. Caleb took over his feeding, and Caleb sat with him in the evenings, the way some boys sit with a dog talking low about nothing, and the horse that had nearly killed Del Sutton in the spring stood quiet under a 16-year-old's hand and listened. "He likes you," Eli told the boy one evening watching from the rail. "More'n he likes me even. You got a gift for it, son. Some folks do. Can't teach it. You either hear what an animal's saying, or you don't, and you do." Caleb flushed with the praise the way boys do when it comes from a man they've decided to measure themselves against. "I learned it from my mama," he said. "She heard him first, when nobody else would." And that was true, and it was the truest thing about the whole strange summer, and Martha, hanging wash on the line she could now afford to string proper, heard it through the open window and had to stop a moment with her hands full of damp linen and just breathe. Eli courted her slow the way he'd promised, and the town watched, and for a while the old habits flickered. Martha caught it in the dry goods store, a held breath, a glance the widow and the horsebreaker, and weren't that just like her, hardly cold from one man before, and the old hardness rose up in her ready to meet it. But it was Ruth Harlan who put a stop to it, and the way she did it told Martha more than any apology had. "I heard what you were thinking, Cora Whitfield," Ruth said loud in the middle of the store to a woman who had said nothing aloud at all. "I could hear it from across the room, you've got that look. And I'll tell you what I'd tell my own daughter if I had one. That woman buried a husband and raised a boy alone and got looked through by this whole town for 3 years, and then she went up a mountain with a rifle and dug up a truth we were all too yellow to dig up ourselves. If she wants a good man to mend her porch and tip his hat and look at her like she hung the moon, then by God she has earned him twice over, and the first soul to whisper otherwise answers to me." Ruth set her parcel down hard on the counter. "Now, is that thread 2 cents or 3? The store was very quiet. And then Cora Whitfield, red to the ears, said, "2 cents, Ruth." And that was the end of the whispering about Martha Calloway and Eli Boone then, and for good. Martha in the back by the bolts of cloth pretended she had not heard. But that night she lay awake a long time turning it over, the strange arithmetic of a life. How a town that had spent 3 years taking from her had in the space of 1 summer begun handing things back. A defender in Ruth Harlan. A trade for her son. A man's slow, patient courtship. Her own name spoken to her face in the street. It was almost more than she trusted. That was the thing she could not shake even in the good weeks. After 3 years of bracing for the next blow, she had near forgotten how to stand when no blow came. She kept waiting for it. She would catch herself flinching at a kind word, the way the gray had flinched at a raised hand. It was Eli, of course, who named it. They were sitting on her mended porch in the long light after supper. Caleb gone to the barn, and Martha had gone quiet in the middle of a sentence, and stayed quiet, and Eli let the silence run a while before he spoke. "You're waiting for it to be taken back," he said. "Aren't you?" Martha looked at him startled. "I know the look," Eli said. He turned his hat slow in his hands. "Wore it myself a long while. You get hurt bad enough long enough, you stop trusting the good. Every kindness feels like the front end of a cruelty you just can't see yet. You spend so long bracing for the fist that when somebody offers a hand, your whole body still flinches. He looked out at the yard. That gray taught me something I'd forgot. I watched him flinch from your hand 100 times before he let it rest. And then one day, he just decided. Decided it wasn't gonna hurt this time. And he let it. Eli's voice was very gentle. A body can decide that too, Martha. It ain't easy. But you can decide the good is real. You can decide to let the hand rest. Martha did not answer for a long moment. The light was going gold across the yard. And then, slow the way the horse had done, she reached over and put her hand in his on the porch, where 7 stones had once fallen, and she let it rest. "All right," she said quietly. "All right. I'll decide it's real." The trial came in the early fall in the county seat, and Martha and Caleb and Eli all went down to testify. Silas Crow did not fight it. That was the strange grace of the end of him, that the man who had killed 5 people and 2 horses to keep a thing buried stood up in the courtroom. And when the judge asked how he would plead, looked across the room at Martha Calloway and said plain, "Guilty, Your Honor, all of it, every name they read." His lawyer flinched. The judge raised an eyebrow, but Crow only shook his head. "A horse brought it all into the light," he said. "Ain't no point me trying to shovel it back into the dark. I'm done shoveling." He hanged in October. Martha did not go to watch, and she would not let Caleb go either, though the boy had thought he wanted to. "There's nothing up on that gallows worth carrying around in your head the rest of your life," she told him. "We brought the truth into the light. That was our part. The rest belongs to the law and to God, and we don't have to watch it to know it's done." The gold was divided, as Dawes had said. The families of the other 2 murdered men were found: a sister in Kansas, a grown son in Texas who had spent 20 years thinking his father had simply abandoned them, and who wept when the letter reached him, not for the money, but because his father had not left him, after all had been murdered, trying to do right. And the difference between those 2 things was the difference between a life of bitterness and a life he could finally make peace with. Martha thought about that often. How a buried truth poisons more than the one it's buried with. How that man in Texas had carried 20 years of believing himself unwanted, and how the Gray's 7 stones had reached all the way to him and set even that right. Henry Calloway's third came to Caleb as promised, held in trust until his majority, with enough release to keep them comfortable in the meantime. Martha did not have to take in mending anymore. She did anyway. Not for the money, for the women who came now not as customers to be served at a distance, but as neighbors who sat in her front room while she worked and told her their troubles. Because the woman who had heard a horse turned out to be a woman who could hear a great many things. And Mercy Hollow had been a long time without anyone who would listen. They married in the spring. When the year had come full circle back to the season, the first stone fell. It was a small wedding in the churchyard, and Jeremiah Pike gave Martha away because there was no one else, and because the old man had wept when she asked him and called it the greatest honor of a long and undeserving life. Caleb stood up for Eli. Ruth Harlan sat in the front row and did not pretend the thing in her eye was dust, though she dared anyone to say so. And the Gray was there. Caleb had brushed him until he shone and braided ribbon into his mane, which the horse suffered with enormous dignity, and the great gray draft horse that the town had once called Cursed stood at the edge of the churchyard in the spring sun and watched the woman who had heard him become a bride. When the words were said and done, when Eli Boone kissed his wife, it was the Gray who broke the solemn hush. He threw up his head and let out a long ringing call, joyful, unmistakable, and the whole churchyard laughed, and Martha laughed through her tears, and she went to him still in her wedding dress, and put her hand on his face, in the place he had once let no one touch, and he leaned his great head into her, and was still. "You did this," she whispered to him, so only he could hear. "Every bit of it. You walked down off that mountain, and you brought me a stone, and you wouldn't quit, and you gave me back my whole life. I hope you know it. I hope somewhere in that great heart of yours, you know what you did." The horse breathed against her slow and content, and she chose to believe he knew. The years were good to them in the way that real years are good. Not without trouble, but with the kind of trouble a family weathers together instead of alone. Caleb grew into a man under Eli's teaching, and he had the gift, the true gift, and word spread. Folks brought him their spoiled horses, their biters and bolters, and the ones other men had given up on, and the boy who had once begged his mother to shoot a frightened animal became known across 3 counties as the young man who could gentle anything, who could hear what a hurt creature was saying when no one else could make sense of it. He never took a horse he couldn't help, and he never, not once, reached for a whip or a spur, because he had learned the first and deepest lesson of his life on a summer porch watching his mother kneel beside a gray that everyone else called a monster. "You don't break a horse that's been broke already," he would tell the men who brought them. "You just got to listen to where it hurts. They'll tell you if you let them. They always tell you." Eli grew old slow and easy at Martha's side, and the scar he had never explained she came to know the story of one winter night by the fire, and it was a hard story, a story of a hurt childhood, and a man who had spent 20 years gone quiet just like the horse. And Martha listened to all of it, the way she listened to everything. And when he was done, he said it was the first time he'd ever told it whole to a living soul, and that setting it down felt like the gray must have felt laying that last stone at her feet. "You're good at it," Eli said, his old hand finding hers in the firelight. "Hearing folks. You hear what they can't say." He smiled. "Whole town knows it now. They come to you the way they used to cross the street to avoid you. You're the one they bring it to, the hard things, the buried things." "Somebody has to be," Martha said. "I spent 3 years with no one to bring mine to. I won't have another soul in this valley go through that if I can help it." The gray lived a long, full life, far longer than Eli had once predicted, far longer than a horse used as hard as he'd been used had any right to. He grew gray about the muzzle, and slow in his great limbs, but he was easy to the end, gentle with the children Caleb eventually brought into the world, patient under the smallest hands. The town that had feared him made him in his old age a kind of legend, the horse that brought the truth down off the mountain, the horse that knew. Children who had not been born when the stones fell grew up on the story. Folks would point him out to travelers passing through. "That's the gray. That's the one. Brought a widow 7 stones and dug up a 20-year murder." God's own truth every word. And every spring on the morning that marked the day the first stone had fallen, Martha would walk out to where the gray was pastured, and she would bring him a treat from her hand, and she would stand with him a while in the early light, and she would tell him she remembered, that she had not forgotten, that she never would. He came to her porch one last time on a spring morning, very old by then, when his great heart was near to giving out, and they all knew it, though no one would say it. Martha heard the slow, heavy hooves before dawn, the way she had heard them the very first morning a lifetime ago. And her breath caught, and she rose from beside her sleeping husband and went to the door and opened it. There he stood, the gray, old and slow and gentle, his muzzle near white, now his dark eyes clouded but still deep, still knowing. He had let himself out of the pasture somehow, the way he had let himself out of Ruth Harlan's chained paddock all those years ago. Because some things a creature decides it will do, and a fence has never yet been built that can stop a horse that has decided. He had come to her porch, the way he had come every morning for 7 mornings a lifetime ago, when no one else in all the world would hear him. But this time he carried no stone. His mouth was empty. He had nothing left to bring her, nothing left to set at her feet. No more truth to drag down out of the dark, because every bit of it was long since brought into the light, and there was nothing left to carry. He had come, only to come. He had come to stand on the porch one last time, with the woman who had heard him. Martha understood. She understood all of it, standing in the doorway in the gray light with her hand pressed to her mouth and the tears running warm down her wrists the way they had that first dawn. She came down the steps slow. She did not bring the rifle. She had not brought the rifle in 20 years, and never would again. She crossed the porch where 7 stones had fallen, and she came to the great old horse, and she put both her arms around his lowered head and held him, and he leaned the whole weight of his great tired body into her gentle, trusting, unafraid, the way he had not been able to do the morning. He first came to her starved and terrified, and called a monster by the whole of a fearful town. "You don't have to carry it anymore," she whispered to him, the very same words she had said on this porch a lifetime ago. Only now they meant something different. Now they meant rest. "Old friend, you've earned it. You've earned every bit of it. You hear me? You brought it all down into the light. Every stone. You set it all down. There's nothing left for you to carry. Nothing in this world or the next." Her voice broke clean through. "So you go on and rest now. You go on. You did everything. You did everything a good and faithful heart could do, and then you did more, and it was enough. It was more than enough." The great gray horse let out a long, slow breath against her shoulder, easy and content the way he had that first morning under the cottonwood, when she'd laid her hand on his face, and the terror finally left him. And then he rested his great old head against her full and trusting, with nothing held back, and nothing feared, and the two of them stood that way a long while in the rising light. The widow, who had once been called strange, and the horse who had once been called cursed. The only two creatures in all of Mercy Hollow, that a frightened town had turned its back on, who had found each other across 7 dawns of stones, and saved each other, each one completely. He did not come again after that morning. He died in his pasture a few days later in his sleep in the spring sun, easy and unafraid, an old horse who had lived to see every wrong thing made right. They buried him under the cottonwood beside the team he had grieved so long. The brother who went down the shaft, and the one who came before, reunited at last, the 3 of them together, under the only shade in that hard country, where 7 white stones still marked the graves Martha had laid out with her own hands a lifetime before. She outlived him by many years, and she lived them well, surrounded by her son and his children, and the good man who had mended her porch and tipped his hat and waited patient until she could believe the good was real. And to the end of her long life, when the children gathered close and asked her to tell it again, the story of the stones, the story of the summer. Everything changed. She would settle back, and her old eyes would go soft and far away, and she would tell them the truest thing she knew. The thing the whole strange summer had taught her, the thing she had built the rest of her life upon. A whole town can look at a wounded thing and call it a monster, because fear is easier than understanding, and a turned back is easier than an open hand. But the truth does not belong to the loud, or the many, or the comfortable. The truth belongs to the one soul brave enough to stop, and look, and listen. And Martha Calloway, who heard what no one else in all the world would hear, had been that one soul, and it had been the saving of her, and the saving of a horse, and the saving of an entire town that never deserved her, and loved her in the end anyway. She had listened when listening cost her everything. And because she listened, the dead were named, the guilty were judged. The buried was raised into the light, and a frightened gray horse, who carried the truth down off a mountain 1 stone at a time, had lived to lay his head, unafraid, against the shoulder of the only person in the world who ever heard him, and that she would tell them. That was a thing no fear and no fence, and no whispering town could ever bury, not in this life, and not in any other world without end.